Hello sociologists, for what will be the final video of lockdown, or at least this lockdown anyway, and the final video before you get back into school itself. So, a heady moment. Or you're watching this after lockdown has ended and you're just watching this because you wanted to catch up with the next part of the lesson, and that is also entirely fine and I really don't mind. The important thing is that it's the last video not only of lockdown, but it's also the last video I'll be doing on observations, specifically observations in context. Now you'll remember from the last video that we've started our journey talking about structured observations, and that was relatively quick and easy to talk through because it's a simple process. We talked about FIAC, for example, and recording the different kinds of talk and the potential issues in validity that provides. We also talked and began to discuss the idea of more participant observations, or rather unstructured observations, and the potential issues that can provide and raise. Participant observation of staff, for example, is a perfectly acceptable thing to do and perfectly viable, but carries with it its own risks and issues. But observing classrooms is easier than gaining permissions to do things like interviews or questionnaires, which seems odd, but there you go. I also shared some of my experiences of observation in that I find it terrifying for reasons I don't fully understand. And also how I observe other people and the potential issues that can have on the example, on the thing you are observing, and how to mitigate that to the best of your ability. So I'm going to pick it up again. We left it with reliability. The examples are throughout, so I'm not too worried about the first E. I guess that means after the we've got to go to the which in this case is validity. I mean, it's always validity. Now, interpretivists really like unstructured observations. Why? Because it's great for doing things like teacher labelling or classroom interactions. Because remember, these things are based on unconscious bias. They're decisions we make without realising we're making them. And so observations allow us to see those things and allow us to observe as sociologists what that actually means, especially teacher labelling, because teachers are very open to the idea of not labelling students. It's drummed into us from day one, you don't do it. But by the same token, because it's unconscious, we might not know we're doing it. So if you're trying to observe, or rather find out about teacher labelling, asking a teacher or even asking the students won't necessarily get you the answers you need. But an observation will show that. And it also clarifies what students actually do and staff actually do. We might think we're doing one thing, but when observed, we're doing quite another. And that isn't necessarily a bad thing, but it's something to be aware of if you're a researcher looking into how schools work or investigating as a sociological concern what goes on in school. I've just realised I've turned the lights off. The lighting here is appalling. I always look this bad. The lighting won't improve it. But there is a problem. There's a power differential. Most researchers, if not all of them, are adults themselves. And if you're observing children, even if they're not the people you're observing, that power differential exists. You're an adult in a highly stratified hierarchical structure. What the children do in front of that adult might not be what they do if that adult were not there. Equally, you're an adult outsider most of the time. Therefore, those children are going to behave in a very different way. Consider, if you're trying to go in to find out how children pass information in classes, you're looking for things like note swapping, where people pass notes to one another back in the old days, or texting on the sly, that sort of thing. You're not going to find that very easily as an adult in the classroom, as every student is automatically going to assume that they'll get into trouble for doing it, because they're doing something that's outside what they're allowed to do, and you are an adult in the classroom. You're the enemy. They're not exactly going to share it with you, are they? So you might not find what you're looking for, and their behaviour may be different as a result of you being there. A false image, we call it. And you could argue that that impacts on validity. However, if you're doing observation, there's a chance to mitigate this to some extent. You can gain the acceptance as a researcher. You can go in and gain trust from the people you're observing, especially if you're there quite a long time or over a period of time before you start taking observations. And we see this in classrooms all the time. You might not realise that teachers do it too. We have to gain your acceptance before we can do what we do. Of course we do. I mean, there's a slight difference there. We're not researching what you're up to. We probably never get to see you as you would be ordinarily. Rather, we get to see you in what we mould our classroom environments to be. But if I were to go in, like I did when I was learning how to teach, and observe a class for the first time, they'd view me with suspicion. I wouldn't really get a good picture, and nor did I expect to get one, of what goes on in the classroom. It was only around the fourth or fifth lesson that I started to see things as they were, if you see what I mean, or more as they were. In my very first observations as a trainee teacher, I discovered that it was a GCSE class that I was observing, and the teacher very deliberately played up my expertise in the First World War, which they happened to be studying. I didn't realise at the time, but it was also his specialist subject. I just assumed that he'd read my CV and assumed I knew more than he did. Of course I did. I was arrogant. And as a consequence, when it came to me doing about the First World War, the students listened with rapt attention. Of course they did. I was the expert. But I also noticed that by the fifth or sixth lesson, I got a feel for which students would act out of turn, which students would misbehave more, what they found funny. I got to see them a little bit more naturally than I had done at the beginning. And the teaching staff who was running it too also tended to forget I was there and started behaving more naturally rather than putting on an act for me, which was really helpful to my development as a teacher. Also, if you're observing teachers, you've got to be aware that teachers are very, very skilled at disguising what they feel and what they think in an observation. More often than not, when we're observed, it's a high-stakes process, and therefore we're very good, we're adept at moulding to fit what we think the observer wants, because that's our job, that's what we do. And you may have noticed this yourselves. Observed lessons are often very different to non-observed lessons. Now, this is my problem. Many of my observed lessons are exactly the same as I would give normally. The only real difference is my nervousness. And if you've ever been unlucky enough to be in a room where I'm being observed, you'll have noticed that. I go a bit weird. But generally speaking, the lesson doesn't change. The lessons are the same whether there's anyone in the room or not. There may be an extra emphasis on timing, but even that's subtle. I notice it. I'm not sure the students do. Well, maybe you can tell me about that when we get back. You can tell me whether I've been successful if you've ever seen that. But teachers are skilled at hiding. Therefore, an observer, a researcher, might not get a true picture. The validity will be impacted. They'll find what the teachers want them to see. And also, there's the problem of language, slang, memes, and meanings, as I've written. It's understanding what the students are actually saying. You use cultural references, you use language, you use words in a different way. Consider the following sentence if were uttered by a teacher and your response to it. Good morning, class. It is time to yeet the morning in, to yeet the impossible yeet. To yeet or not to yeet, that is the yeetening. At that point, you'd realise either the teacher was deliberately taking the Michael, or was not understanding of what the word yeet actually meant, because the meaning of the word yeet is specific to your cultural touchstone. Therefore, an observer coming in, a researcher, and you using the word yeet, even in a euphemistic sense, might not understand where you're going. That's the memes. The slang, I've told you before about deebs in the place that I used to work, where students used it all the time. There was deebs and there was par. Par was a substitute for a word involving human excrement. Why par, I never did find out. Deebs was shortening for don't be tight, do you remember? Or you've been trapped. That is slang. And I would argue that unless you were immersed in that school's culture, you might not necessarily know what was meant by those terms. If you heard someone go, oh, deebs, you wouldn't necessarily know what they were referring to. I don't know of any slang in Ecclesbourne that's quite that developed, but I'm sure there's some. You'll know better than me. There's also the use of language. Your use of the word to analyse, for example, is different to my use of the word analyse. Your understanding of the term evaluate is different to my understanding of the term evaluate. Now, all right, they're technical terms within lessons, and to some extent, I get to shape how you use those terms. To a researcher coming in, though, they might realise that different lessons have different meanings, but they won't necessarily know what the meanings of the language are. And the way you use language, they might not necessarily know. The amount of times you guys tie yourself in tortuous knots to get would of or could of in a sentence structure blows my mind, not least because would have is actually a shortening of would have, and therefore should be would apostrophe VE, not would space OF. But you don't need that construction. But people will put themselves out to write it. And I've noticed that since I started teaching, and it's increasing. A researcher coming in that has not had that grounding might not understand why it keeps turning up and might not understand what is meant by it. Homonyms and homophones, words that sound the same, also proliferate in schools. Of course they do. You know you're being sucked in as a member of staff sometimes when students use certain words and they want you to repeat them. That's always a giveaway. But a researcher might not understand what's going on there. And then we come to the problem of the Hawthorne effect. That idea that people respond to being observed and respond unnaturally to being observed. How do you beat that? And I've come up with this euphemistically titled The Tall Man, because I quite liked the anecdote that I'm going to finish on. Covert observation is usually impossible in schools. Everyone knows you're there. Everyone knows you're observing. You can't exactly hide and come in with that meme, what up, fellow students, with a skateboard and a backwards cap. It won't work. Or put another way, the presence of the researcher influences the behaviour of those that they are observing, both students and staff. Hammersley looking at teachers in the staff room. The teachers in the staff room are going to respond to that interloper in their space. King, in 1984, decided to try and deal with this as much as he could when he was observing a primary school by blending in, i.e. he turned up, made no eye contact, did not respond to any questions from the students in the primary school, was just sort of there, and was there short periods at first and gradually extended it until his idea was they just saw him as part of the furniture. He got so far into this that he actually started using the Wendy house in the primary school classroom as a kind of hide to observe from, like sitting in it and then just sitting there and looking out through the windows so that the students couldn't see him and couldn't make eye contact. Now, that sounds creepy and weird in my head, but you can see why he was trying to do it. The whole idea was that the children would just get used to him being there and phase it out like they would a new display or, I don't know, a Lego in the corner. Something that's always there and you just forget's there. Now, you can imagine that I can see what he was trying to do there, and it could have been quite effective. But as Ball pointed out in 1993, it's really difficult to know what the children thought of the tall man hiding in the Wendy house in the middle of the classroom all that time. That's got to affect your behaviour on some level. Not least the students. What about the member of staff? How is that classroom going to respond, and what did they actually do to... I mean, they're going to respond. They're not just going to ignore it. It's not something you can just pretend isn't there, which is obviously what he was going to go for. So that's going to affect the validity, is my point. And then you've got the ethics of the situation, the second E. We're on to the part, the second and the ethics of it, well, covert observation comes with a lot of caveats, as we've discussed already. In an educational setting, they are made much bigger. Students, children, are generally vulnerable. They carry within them many vulnerabilities anyway. We talked about this when we talked about the wider context. And therefore you've got to take into consideration what damage you could do through your observation and what you're trying to look for, and recording of the findings and publishing of the findings and what those findings might show, and also the process by which you gain your information. If you're going in covertly and making links, which you've got to do to make validity, and gaining trust, that's going to harm those people going forwards. It just is. It's going to mess with people who are still developing what they understand by trust and still developing who to trust and how to trust. You going in there and messing it up with covert observation could be really dangerous. Doing so with staff could also be quite damaging. I mean, imagine a member of staff ends up opening up to you and then finds out that you were just there to gain the information. That's quite a big deal, and well, staff are humans too, and we operate in a high-stress environment. That's going to have an effect on our mental state. You've got to take those things into consideration. As a consequence, the textbook argues that mostly covert is inappropriate due to the setting. I can see where we're coming from here. Delamont argues that there's also a further problem. Observers, researchers, will see or hear things. They'll see things like students stealing or students breaking rules or students even breaking the law. And that knowledge has to be dealt with. You might argue that on a moral level, You've got to report the rule breaking and the law breaking. You might argue, though, on a practical level, you shouldn't, because you're trying to gain the trust of these people. And if you turn out to be an agent for those who enforce the rules, you lose that trust and rapport with the students. Doubly so with adults. You see them breaking some rule, well, what do? I'm not talking like the big ones, you might argue the extreme and obvious ones. I'm just talking about basic things, like, I don't know, taking the wrong stationery or using a photocopier with someone else's code. Do you report that? And Delamore argued that there has to be a care to protect the identity of staff and students, especially in a marketised education system, where public image, you might argue, is the most important thing a school has going for it or going against it. Schools have to be very, very careful about their public image. Many academies, for example, employ PR firms. It's that important to put out the right image. You've got to be careful with things. A place where I used to work got a nickname because it was widely supposed that a lot of the population in that school were homosexuals. Now, to be fair, that was borne out by the stats. There were more incidents of people coming out, if you'll forgive the expression, in the school that I worked at than there were in other local schools. So there was something to the appellation that was applied. But you could also argue that it was only applied because people felt comfortable enough to come out, and maybe other schools had the problem of a more homophobic environment. One of the things I noticed when I came here actually was we would have termed that at my old place rather homophobic. I'm sure you don't think of yourselves as such. I'm sure you don't think of the situation at schools being particularly homophobic, but it kind of is compared to where I came from, which is fascinating and may explain the appellation. My point being, the names that you get from research have an effect on how people view your establishment. And therefore, as Delamont points out, you've got to be very, very careful what you report and how you report it and how much you reveal. And that can mean some of your research has to be ignored, which lends its own ethical and moral problem. What happens if you go into an establishment and find things that are obviously going to harm its public image? Do you report those findings? You could bring the school down. And you've just made trust with the students and the staff, perhaps. It's an interesting moral and ethical issue. Don't think there's an answer, by the way. It's just something to consider. There's also the representativeness, the second R. The first was reliability. The second is representativeness. Still a word, but hey-ho. Think about the vast scale of the education system. In the UK, there are over 4,000 secondary schools. There are 30,000, more than, primary schools. There are over 350 colleges, like sixth form colleges, for example. In any school, there's also vast scale. The average secondary school has 70 lessons going on at any given time. Anyone, a researcher going in for any kind of observation, cannot hope to observe enough to make a typical assumption. The best you can do is a sample, and that sample can be incredibly small because of the nature of the game when it comes to observation, because of the time and the necessity to gain acceptance. You're only going to be able to observe a very, very small amount of that vast array of things going on. Willis, for example, in 1977, kept his sample size to just 12 boys. How representative were those 12 boys? Were they even representative of the school in which he was operating? Were they even representative of boys? Were they representative of even those 12 boys? It is unlikely that any observation, unstructured, will produce a representative sample, obviously, because there's so much going on. Even your experience in school will tell you this. Your experience of a classroom is different to someone else's experience of a classroom. When we're back in school, ask from people that you've not really been mixing with from your year group, and you'll find different experiences. Surely you're aware of how different lessons and different teachers operate, and teachers you've never met are a mystery to you, except what other people say, and you might find that that's not true, or at least doesn't fit your experience. So There's a lot going on. There's an incredible amount of data being produced every day, and nothing on an unstructured level can possibly be representative of that. Hammersley said himself of his study of teachers in the staff room that many teachers treated him with suspicion. Therefore, he observed only those that accepted him enough to allow him to do so, which obviously created a sample bias. That is, only a certain kind of member of staff would allow themselves to be seen and observed by him, even though he was covert. So whoever the researcher is only going to get part of the picture. I remember Wright when we were talking about her ethnicity and her gender and the difference it made with how people interacted with her. That in itself is going to bring in less representation. It's going to bring in a bias in the sample. Remember that example of the behaviour support worker who became a head of year? The sorts of people that they saw when they were a behaviour support worker versus the sorts of people that they saw as a head of year, whilst having significant crossover, I imagine, would be very different in both of those settings. They're going to get a different sample. Of course they are. That's just how it works. See that? Something's gone off. I don't know what it was. Longitudinal studies, a word on this, because I've already covered theoretical issues, so there's no T at the end of pervert. Let's talk about longitudinal studies. Longitudinal is just a posh word of saying a group that is followed and studied over time. It's a longer period of study. So you start in one place and you move slowly along and you end at another place. I've done that the wrong way around, doesn't matter. You can add in questionnaires, you can add in interviews, you can add in secondary documents. These studies are bigger and more in depth, and they use observation as part of that. Here are some examples of longitudinal studies and what they were doing. There's Lacey's 4-year observation of Hightown Grammar School, for example. Over 4 years, Lacey observed and studied what was going on in Hightown Grammar School, and because it was such a longitudinal study, got a feeling of movement. So different cohorts, different year groups, different students, different teachers, and the changes over time. So what was something that was cultural and what was something that was unique to an individual. And because it's 4 years, you can differentiate between those things. The data you gain is more likely to be useful. Douglas carried out a survey of 5,632 children born in the first week of March in 1946, and he took them throughout schooling, therefore for 7 years or longer, to find out what happened to them over time. And that was an interesting study. You can see how that would generate data that could do a number of different things. The NCDS, the National Children's Development Society, carried out the lives, a survey similar, of the lives of all born in the same week in 1958, and then carried that going, and it's ongoing. That's going to create an incredible amount of data, and obviously when it comes to schooling, is going to really, really be interesting because your sample is set by birth. And wherever they move, whatever they do, you're going to find out what they do in school and their outcomes, and you can start talking about cause and effect. You might be aware of these studies already. Feinstein in 2003 used the NCDS study that I've previously mentioned, and also something called the British Cohort Study, which follows students born in 1970, to ascertain what difference class differences made in terms of performance and behaviour in schools. And you can see how you can do that. That's a secondary use of documentation, but it is still a longitudinal observational study, or rather it's two. What's good about this? I've colour-coded it. Green for bing, good. So bing, developments over time. You're not looking at a snapshot like you are with a questionnaire or like you could do with an interview. You're seeing how things change. You're observing that change. You're getting a feeling for what's happening in society at that time. Bing! Secondly, you've got the identifying causes. Feinstein and Douglas were both able to produce a cause and effect relationship between class and academic performance and back it up with data to prove the point. I don't mean Brent Spiner, by the way. I mean literal numerical stuff. Some people got that joke. However, there are also problems. The first is the sample attrition. 1/3 of the 17,400 people being followed by the NCDS were lost between 1958 and 1999. maybe through death, maybe through lack of contact, maybe just dropping out because they were no longer interested, or didn't want to be observed any further. We have no way of knowing what that sample attrition does, which groups of people are leaving. Those that remain are not going to be typical like they were at the beginning. They've remained for a reason. And so the sample almost becomes less valid and representative over time as people leave it. We've talked about this when people were returning questionnaires. The type of people that return a questionnaire might not be representative of the population at whole. Points to mug. It's over there somewhere. Or that way, I don't know. The mug points everywhere to mug. I'm not exactly representative is my point. Also, they produce incredible amounts of data. I mean, truly incredible. You could lose yourself for a lifetime in a single longitudinal study. Not because it takes that long to gain the data, but because once the data's there, what do you do with it? There's so much. How can you possibly have your eyes across it all and be able to use it all in an effective way? Consider yourselves when you're doing A-levels, you've only got 4 subjects maximum, 3 most of you, and consider how much data you're getting thrown at you. Can you even cope with that? Now factor that in by 7 years and throw in other types of data, you'd drown. How could you possibly use that? Also, they're longitudinal. They, by definition, take a long time to produce. They're very slow to come up with results. It's all very well starting this study, but by the time you've finished it, does anyone still want to know the results? So you can see the problem here. And that leads to the final, which is the cost. So Parker in 1998 carried out a 5-year study of illegal drug use in adolescents, covering 1,125 young people. And you can see why that would be really, really useful data and why people would want it. So it was carried out between 1993 and 1998. 1998 is the publication date. But the cost of that study was £380,000. That's insane. That's an incredible amount of cash. How many sociologists are going to have that amount of money or funding to throw at something? So although they're very useful, although they're very interesting, they're difficult to set up, they're costly to produce, they take a long time to produce results, and the amount of data they produce makes it really hard to actually make use of the data you collect. Yeah, that is the end. This, therefore, brings us to the official end of this section of the course, talking about observations. And with it, the end of the last video in lockdown. It's quite sad, really. I was quite enjoying those. Nevertheless, if you have been, thank you for watching. I look forward to seeing most of you, if not all, in the classroom and going over things in a little bit of a different way. Hopefully, when you're back in classes, we'll have a chance to discuss, you'll have questions, you'll have things that have been drawn by these, and you'll have things that you want to say. As long as it's not too insulting, I'll be happy to hear it. Well, even if it's insulting, actually, as long as you're not disrespectful, or at least if you're disrespectful in a manner that doesn't get you into trouble, I'm happy with that. Let me know how it's gone. And also, think about the ideas that I've given you about studying yourselves, what education is like. The sorts of observations you're collecting now will be useful if you're intending to do sociology in the future. So why not start a longitudinal study of you and your cohorts? Why not start observing the school on the QT? Obviously, don't go too far. But equally, you can ask for permission. You can start carrying out your own observations, proper participant observations. Imagine what you could do at university. I've already carried out my study. Here it is. And that would be amazing. Also, possibly slightly unethical. Anyway, I'm just saying. Yeah, we're at the end of the video. Have a lovely whatever rest you've got left before you coming into school. Be prepared for that. We're looking forward to seeing you. And yeah, thank you very much for being with me throughout this time. I've enjoyed it. I don't know what else to say. I'm not very good with goodbyes. So I guess I'll see you in the classroom. I'll finish on that. That works, doesn't it?